I knocked on the glass door at 6:03 p.m., my hand still smelling faintly of soap and rosemary from the little stew I had cooked that afternoon. And she opened the door and looked at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered in from the street. She did not smile. She did not move to take the chipped mug I clutched as if it were a talisman. My name, her mother's name, sat on the tip of my tongue like a stale coin nobody wanted. I felt the fingers of that old habit, say nothing, bend, accept, slowly go still. Had I learned nothing in 60 years of waking before dawn to mend a leak, to hold a fevered child, to stitch a dress from a thrifted sheet? Was I to be the relic my own hands had polished? They had always called me gentle. My hands were gentle. They had pressed bandages and bread and soft cheeks. But there is a moment when gentleness becomes a kind of armor you must take off if you mean to be seen. I had not yet taken it off. The house smelled of lemon polish and new leather, a smell that speaks of money and the polite cruelty that money breeds. The portraits on the wall smiled with painted teeth. Her husband, my son-in-law, stood just beyond the foyer, a man who wore winter coats in August and watched the world like a ledger. He said without malice, "She's not expected, Helen." Helen. She had never called me by my name like that when I carried casseroles through their door. It was an accounting, that word, expected, unexpected. A family budget that did not include me. I had a mason jar at home filled with nickels and folded bills, the small deposits of a life that had been modest but honest. In that jar lay the proof of every sacrifice I had made, the coin from the year I paid for my son's school books, the crumpled 10 from the time I chose bread over medicine. I had pearls too, old, mismatched, stones that had come to me through a different life when my neck still rose straighter in photographs. I wore them sometimes because they made me remember I had been someone before being anybody's mother. "Come in, Mama," my daughter said finally, as if the door had been an inconvenience rather than an opening. Her voice slid past me, cold and practiced. Her gloves left a faint diamond shape on the cream armchair when she sat. I set my mug on the low table and felt the pattern of cracked glaze under my palm, a pattern that had kept me awake during sewing nights and 1,000 quiet prayers. I told myself I would be quiet. I told myself I was old, and old women must be grateful for crumbs. But gratitude is not a demand that one be swallowed. The first thing I noticed, before the cold, before the dustless light, was the silence about the attic. There had always been an attic in that house. In every house, an attic is where the past hides. I had once shoved a small, leather-bound box up there, a locked thing with a brass clasp. It had contained letters, one faded photograph of a man with a rueful smile, a folded legal paper I had carried like a secret, because it spoke of a promise my husband had whispered on his deathbed. I had never told my daughter the name written on those letters. Secrets like soup must be tended or they spoil. "Do you need anything?" my daughter asked, and the question was a gauze that let no air in. She asked as if I might require a new lamp or a driver. Nobody in that house looked me in the eyes and wondered how the years had carved grooves into my hands. They saw only some useful anecdote, grandmotherly, quaint, forgettable. I had been invited to their spring gala 2 nights earlier, an affair of crystal and ledger, and I came with a roast and the mason jar, tucked in my apron as if to offer not a gift of wealth, but an offering of belonging. They had taken the roast politely, and halfway through the evening, a woman with hair like cloud and teeth like currency leaned across the champagne and whispered, "She can't stay, dear." My daughter had smiled then, with the sweetness of a ledger entry being balanced. That night I walked home in my sensible shoes, the cobblestones ringing like a small percussion of every footstep that had not been congratulated. I climbed the step to my small kitchen and placed the mason jar on the windowsill. The moon glanced off the glass, and I thought of how small things remember you. That night, I dreamt of a man whose voice my husband had never spoken. He had been a name kept like a secret ingredient. He only arrived in whispers, in the way the house smelled of lavender when spring came. My husband had been a carpenter, and he had once said, on a cold March morning when the bread was thin and our hands were thinner, "If when I am gone, any child forsakes you, remember there are other hands." He had spoken as if naming a promise. I held the memory to my breast like a warm thing. There had been a note in the mailbox that day, an envelope, cream, with the handwriting of their lawyer, Mr. Braddock, who had tended their legal affairs with cool competence. The letter was short, a November kind of letter. Please be advised, the durable power of attorney for assets located at 18 Marlow Lane has been updated as of March 30th, 2025. I had read the words and my chest had fit to burst. Durable power of attorney, the legal instrument that can place one person as the decision-maker for another's affairs, was not a phrase for a kitchen table. The date sat there like a small, bright stone, March 30th, 2025. It was, in my life, the sound of a lock clicking. I am not a clever woman. I am a careful one. I had, like every careful woman, kept copies of things in odd places. A letter folded in an old cookbook, a prescription hidden under the lid of a biscuit tin, a sealed envelope tucked between two panes in the attic window. I had learned where to hide my life from itself, but the world, it seemed, had a way of rewriting who was careful. When a child becomes rich enough to feel frightened by the memory of her mother's hands, she will buy silence and the language to say it. "You shouldn't be here tonight," she said softly then. The words were wrapped in velvet. "We are celebrating with family." Family, I thought. A family that had not come for me when the bank wanted my name on a paper. A family that had a ledger where they would write my absence as an expense. I told her nothing. I folded my hands on my lap and looked at her wedding portrait on the mantel. It was a photograph where she wore a dress of a color I could not afford to name and a smile I had taught her in prayer. I had taught her how to make tea and how to plead without shouting. Had I taught her to close the door? The next morning, at 5:12 a.m., I woke to a sound I had not expected to hear in that house. Someone praying in the garden. There are certain sounds that belong to mornings, birds, the kettle, but prayer is a private bell. I sat on my porch with my chipped mug warming my fingers and listened. The voice was low and ragged with age, the kind of voice that has been used to the same words for decades. It was the gardener, Matteo, an old man who tended the roses and who had worked for my daughter's family for as long as I could remember. He stood beneath the magnolia and murmured a name over and over, like a monk with beads, like a man charting the distance across the sea. Henri. Henri, Henri, he said. The syllables hung in the cool air like small bells. The name dropped into me like a stone into a jar. Henri, Henri Beaumont. It was a name I had not spoken since the night my husband had clutched my hand and said, "Promise me you won't tell." I had promised, in that hushed way that seals a thing with sorrow. Henry had been a man whose footprints were stitched into my history, an old friend of my husband's, a man with good hands and a terrible love. He had disappeared when the war came, or perhaps when pride became a shrapnel. There had been rumors. There had been a locked leather box in the attic that I told myself I would open when the moon was high and my courage a little stronger. Matteo said the name again, at 5:17 a.m., and then he paused, as if listening to a voice the rest of the world could not hear. He crossed himself, and the morning folded itself around him. I stood and put my hand to the rail. My palm hummed with something like warning. Why was a man who clipped hedges in the dawn keeping Henry's name in his mouth like a rosary? Why did the syllables sound like a chant calling me forward? I had thought my life would be spent in small ironies, my daughter's diamonds, my mason jar. But there was a large and inevitable machine moving, paperwork, lawyers, the quiet rearrangement of names on deeds. I remembered something else then. The last time I had been in that house for the holidays, Mr. Braddock had asked me, politely, if I had any legal documents, wills, powers of attorney, anything that might affect the estate. I had laughed and said I had nothing. I did not know at the time that one can own, in the eyes of the law, more than a tired kitchen and a lifetime of memories. They could list you as an expense and put your name beside the columns like a number. On March 30th, 2025, when the durable power of attorney had been updated, the entry had read in Mr. Braddock's navy hand that my daughter, Elise Davenport, would be the agent with full authority over my affairs should I be unable to act. I had not signed any such paper. I had not met with him on that day, but I knew, as one knows how heat rises and kitchens cool, that papers can be smoothed, signatures practiced, and that lawyers can be men who do not ask enough questions. The line between a legal document and a theft is a very narrow one, and it is often crossed by people who believe they are entitled. When you are a mother, you live in a chronology of wounds, the fever that eventually leaves, the schoolyard bruises, the heartbreaks. Betrayal, when it comes from a child's hand, arrives as a new hard thing. It is not a bruise that fades. It is a room that is rearranged, and you find yourself standing in the wrong place. I had said once, when my husband's cough had become a permanent thing, that perhaps I would move in with Elise and help with the baby. She had laughed and said, "We'll take care of you, Mama." Those 2 words were a promise I had believed. I had tied that phrase to my pearls. Now the pearls lay like small moons in a velvet pouch in my bedside table. I had put them there after my husband died, the pearls being, in a way, an apology to myself for an earlier time when I had let a man's pride weigh more than my need for clean hands. They were not worth the house. They were worth dignity, and in this new arithmetic, my dignity did not compute. I had thought to leave a note for my daughter, a small thing about dinner one night, but the thought of being managed with a smile made me stiffen. I would not be reduced to an item on an invitation list. That day, a neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, came and knocked on my door. She was the kind of neighbor who knows everyone's business and treats it like a domesticated bird. She said, "I saw Elise signing something at Mr. Braddock's office on April 3rd, 2 days before the gala." She said it with a curiosity that did not belong to tenderness. April 3rd, 2 days before the gala. My calendar, which had become a corridor of birthdays and doctor's appointments, suddenly had a new footstep on it. My heart made a small, astonished clatter. What could she have signed? A guest list? A menu? Or a paper that could erase my name? I went back to the house in the daylight the next week under the pretense of returning a casserole dish. The driveway was longer under my feet than I remembered. The gravel crunched like someone stepping through frost. The butler, Mr. Harrow, took the dish as if it were a parcel of contraband. "Elise is not at home," he said. "She is at a board meeting." The house swallowed me with its high ceilings. I walked into the parlor where their family photos hung like a jury. My own face, smaller and more wrinkled in a silver frame, looked back at me as if asking why I had allowed my life to be removed from the shelf. There were papers on the side table, neat and economical. A pamphlet from a bank, a flyer about charitable giving, a glossy program, Davenport Foundation Gala, April 5th, 2025. My hands found a small envelope tucked beneath the ledger. Inside was a single sheet, and on it was typed the phrase, "Immediate family members have received notification. Please RSVP to Mr. Braddock by April 1st. The dates stacked like dominoes in my mind. March 30th, April 1st, April 3rd, April 5th. The rhythm felt organized. It felt purposeful. I sat heavily into the parlor chair, feeling the pattern of the fabric under my knees like a cross-stitch that had been interrupted. I had once believed, with the innocence of a woman who had raised children on boiled potatoes and prayers, that blood was a binding contract. I had believed that to carry a person in your body was to be marked. How naive, that kind of thinking. There are families that adjust their contracts as if they are garments. When a thread is displeasing, they pull it out. They tidy the seam. There was one more thing I noticed in the parlor, a small, laminated card on the coffee table with an address and a bank name. Marlowe Lane Trust. Account number ending 3219. A number, a name. I did not know yet what the account was for, or whether it held my past as if it were an annuity. But I felt suddenly as if there were a ledger, with my name on one side and the words "transferred" on the other. I stood up to leave with my casserole dish, and the butler watched me with the pity of someone who had been instructed in how much sympathy to dispense. At the door, I caught the sound of Mateo's voice again, this time coming from the kitchen. He was talking quietly into a phone, and at first I thought he was speaking to a friend. The syllables were careful. Then I heard him say very quietly, "She's awake, and she came today." He paused, and then he added, "I said her name. I said Henri." The phone clicked off. I did not know then what that name would mean. I only knew that a thread had been pulled, and it had left a loose end dangling in the morning air. There are moments when the past sits up, It coughs and shows its teeth. I felt it move in me like a stirred net. I walked home that afternoon with the casserole dish balanced on my arm and my mason jar chinking faintly in my bag. I placed the jar on my windowsill and watched the light find its way through the coins. My house, small and leaning with character, held the smell of soup and the radio playing a midsummer waltz. I made tea and put the pearls in my palm. They were cool and in their way defiant. The mason jar was a little heavier for the weight of new worry. That night, I lay awake and recalled the letter I had once hidden in the biscuit tin. A letter from a man who had promised to return and who had never done so. There had been a name written in the margin, Henri Beaumont, like an accusation or a benediction. I did not open the attic that night. I told myself tomorrow. Tomorrow held the shape of possibility. I also wrote his name, Henri, upon the inside of my mind, as if making a list in my head. Names to unpeel, drawers to open, conversations to overhear. For a life spent in the small, precise labor of caring, I had always thought that the world was a manageable thing. But someone had begun to rearrange the furniture in my home without asking. Someone had decided which rooms I could enter. If this is a story of revenge, then let it be known. Revenge is not born in the moment of a gloved hand, nor in the rustle of paper, but in the slow, accumulating indignities that an old woman keeps like coins in a jar until the collection becomes heavy enough to use as a tool. I had not yet decided whether I was to be a relic or a force. A promise is not a piece of paper, it is a weathered thing that returns sometimes. Like a tide, Dumas would have said, when a heart is betrayed by its own, that heart becomes a ledger of wounds, and wounds, like ink, can be read and used. They say that the thing that keeps a woman awake is not loneliness, but a mounting ledger of small wrongs that add up until they demand payment. For weeks, the ledger in my chest had been a secret account. The looks, the polite displacements, the updated papers that wore my name away like moths. In part 1, I had counted dates and coins. In the weeks that followed, I began to count people and moments. Each one told me which side of the fence I now lived on. The side that watches big cars pass and pretends the road is not there. Road after the visit with the casserole and the quiet. Reading of Mr. Braddock's Navy announcement, days folded into each other like the pleats of a skirt I had once hemmed. I tried the small resistances at first. The polite calls, the cards for birthdays, the tidy attendance at the Sunday service that made my hands look as if they still belonged in the world of etiquette. But I began to notice new things. Bank statements that came to a house I had once known by the smell of orange peel. Invitations that bore watermarks I could not read. And worst of all, the way my daughter's eyes slid from me when someone else spoke of money. There was a night when I sat with my pearls in my lap and unfolded the little map of past kindnesses. My son-in-law, whose voice always sounded like a pen, had been appointed to the board of a new nonprofit. Elise had been photographed for magazines that used terms like philanthropic vision. Their lives had come to wear labels that made the small kitchen in which we once laughed look like an inconvenient footnote. Yet bread had been broken in that small kitchen. A child had been pulled from my arms between breaths. Promises had been made in whispers, not contracts. Those whispers can be bought, and contracts, as I learned, can be bought, borrowed, and bent. The first real act of aggression, because indifference is aggression, when it comes from your child, came 3 weeks after the durable power of attorney entry had been placed like a smooth stone on my table. I received a form in the post, a notice from Marlowe Lane Trust, account ending 3219, that certain distributions had been reallocated pending review. The letter was careful with its language. Temporarily withheld pending verification of beneficiary status. It smelled of bureaucratic control. I had thought that to be called a beneficiary was a small domestic triumph. The notice, however, read like a cold arithmetic note. Your claim is on hold. I visited Mr. Braddock's office the next day, taking the slow route through the city so that my hands could steady and my mind could measure each step. He received me with the soft competence of a man who believes legal precedence is a sacrament. He had the air of having read many wills and seen many griefs, and he folded me with polite economy. You were listed as an interested party. he said. He did not look surprised. He sounded instead practiced in the art of saying little. However, the durable power of attorney was updated on March 30th, 2025. Ms. Davenport is the agent. There will be a review to assess the designation. Did I sign anything? I asked, my voice a paper-thin thing. No, Mrs. Turner, he said. We have no record of your signature on that document. That should have been the end of it, an administrative hiccup. But his hand rested on a folder, and I saw, for the first time, the cool possibility that the paper world could be made to do what people wanted. I can walk you through the process to contest this, Mr. Braddock added, as if he were offering a care plan for a seasonal cough. He took care to give me the names of forms I might need: affidavit of heirship, request for accounting, petition to set aside undue influence. The legal names were like small weapons, iron and cold. I wrote them down in ink that trembled. When I left his office, the spring air tasted like ledger pages. I began to collect allies in tiny domestic ways. Mrs. Caldwell, who knew everyone's shopping habits, brought me a slice of lemon meringue one afternoon and said, I don't trust Braddock. He's too fond of polished shoes. Mateo, the gardener who had said Henri's name under the magnolia, began to bring me stray mail that came to their house by mistake, as if guilt pricked his hands whenever an envelope had been misdelivered. He would put the letters on my porch and walk away like a watchman whose duty was compassion. It was Mateo who first told me, under the shelter of my back fence, what he'd heard in the kitchen that day. I had been sent away like a rainstorm. Heard her say it on the phone, he said in his low voice. Told someone to make the paperwork look old, dated before the gala, said, make it April 3rd, it will look natural. He rubbed his hands like he was trying to wash the sound from his palms. She named Henri. He said the name like a coin dropped into a jar. I was learning how to listen to the world, listen to the shuffle of papers, the tone of a lawyer's voice, the way the gardener moves his lips when he's made a promise. There is a kind of hearing that cuts through age. Mine had sharpened. My first concrete triumph, a small but real thing, was a photocopy of an email that landed in my mailbox as if delivered by an invisible bird. The envelope had no return address, and the photocopy had been smudged in the corner, but it bore the name of Mr. Braddock and the title, Urgent, Codicil Draft. I put on my glasses and read until the letters blurred. The email, dated April 3rd, 2025 at 9:03 a.m., read in part, per our discussion, please prepare a codicil to alter Mrs. Turner's distribution. Mrs. Davenport will be present on April 4th for execution. Ensure the notary is available and that the document reflects a contemporaneous date of April 3rd, 2025 for appearance of authenticity. Discretion required. There it was, the intent on paper. A plan, a codicil, an amendment to a will being unlawfully timed to appear as if it had been contemporaneous with my consent. They would not simply change a list, they would change the past. I felt as if the room had spun like a plate off its stand. I went to the bank with the email in my hand. The bank manager, an obliging man named Mr. Klein, was kind on the surface. He typed and clicked, and then, with a small frown, brought up a screen. There was a transfer on April 4th, 2025 at 9:52 a.m. from account ending 321 to Everglade Holdings LLC, $230,000, he said. He said the number like a figure in a balance book. And a subsequent wire on April 6th, 2025, won $200,000 to Davenport Family Foundation. The numbers fell like two stones into the jar I had set on my windowsill. $230,000. $200,000. When you have lived most of your life on a careful budget, numbers like that make a small, private sound in your bones. I carried the photocopy of the email home and set it next to my pearls. Those two things, one the evidence of intent, one the token of dignity, lay side by side like a judgment. I felt the old promise my husband had whispered in the cold of the kitchen push against my ribs. There was a pattern now: papers, transfers, dates. Someone had planned an erasure. My rising action, as the playwrights call it, continued in small, intense episodes. I learned that Mr. Braddock had been seen meeting with Elise in a cafe on April 1st at 2:14 p.m., 2 days before the supposed execution. I learned through Mrs. Caldwell's gossip that a notary named Iris Petroff had been scheduled for April 4th, but that she had canceled citing illness. I learned through a stray receipt that a private courier had carried a legal packet from Mr. Braddock's office to the notary service on April 3rd at 5:42 p.m. Each fact was a nail driven into a larger plank. I would need to pry them, one by one, and pry them loudly. There are moments when a life rearranges itself with the force of a storm. Mine had been a long, patient weathering of small injustices, and yet I felt a fire that had been banked for too long begin to breathe. I took a bold step. I wrote a letter to the probate court requesting a review and attached the photocopy of Mr. Braddock's email. It is one thing to hold a suspicion and another to place it in the hands of a clerk with a stamp. The reply from the clerk came with the official calm of an institution. A petition will be scheduled, it read, with a date for a preliminary hearing, May 12, 2025, at 10:00 M. I circled the date with a hand that shook not with fear, but with something far sharper: resolve. Yet I knew a hearing is a theater, and theaters require scripts. My granddaughter, Lily, bless her young heart, surprised me. She had been away at university and returned when she heard the gossip. She brought with her a bright legal intern she had met at school, a woman named Iris Petroff, the same notary who had supposedly canceled. It turned out Iris had indeed been scheduled for April 4th, yet she had never been contacted by Mr. Braddock. Rather, she had been called by an unknown number 3 days earlier and offered $500 to simply be present, while a client signed some paperwork and to not ask questions. Iris had declined. She had a conscience that felt like lace, and it had holes where truth could pass. She now sat across from me and said, "If you want me to, I will check the notary logs. I will help." Having someone with access to a notary's ledger was like finding a lantern at sea. Iris dug through the logs with the tenacity of a woman who had learned to read more than books. She found an entry, a false entry, dated April 4th, 2025, with a signature that did not match the notary's usual flourish. Someone had typed the entry into the ledger after the fact. Iris photographed the entry and sent it to me with an attached note. "This is falsified." I felt the air go thin. The falsified ledger, the email, the transfers. They were threads of a seam being pulled. Every discovery was a new wound, but also a new weapon. I began to talk to people my daughter did not expect her mother to speak. 2 bank clerks, couriers, the woman who cleaned the notary's office. Each of them gave me small things: a receipt, a schedule, a voicemail. The voicemails were the most telling. Voices leave fingerprints. One voicemail was from a number I did not know, recorded on April 2nd at 7:11 p.m. The voice was Elise's, crisp and practical. "Braddock," she said, "ensure the codicil is dated April 3rd. Make it look like it was in motion before the gala. I cannot have any questions." The letter of her voice was calm. The intention was sharp as a blade. The recording was not professional evidence by my hands, perhaps, but it could be used to construe intent. I kept it on a small cassette player in my kitchen like a talisman. Meanwhile, Henri's name continued to echo through the houses and hedges of my life. Iris, who had the notary ledger and a determination like a blade, told me something cryptic one afternoon as we sat with tea. "Mrs. Turner," she said, "have you ever met Henri Beaumont?" I had to close my eyes. The addict's letter had been sealed for decades. My mind stumbled through memory. "Yes," I said. "Once, long ago. He was my husband's friend. There were letters." The color of the tea grew dull in the cup. There is a small ledger at the Marlowe Lane Trust, an old codicil that lists Henri Beaumont as executor in a will dated July 12, 1978. We will request a search. Iris's words were careful as she put down her cup. If we find that codicil, it will prove an earlier disposition existed. To prove the earlier will existed would be to prove that there had been an intention to leave me something important. If the earlier will had language that favored me, then the recent codicil, if forged, would be plainly criminal. The law tends to bow before paper and signatures, but the law also bows before evidence of bad faith. At this mid-turn, where the pieces began to fall together and the plot tightened, I must take a breath and say, as Dumas might, that when a man thinks himself the architect of another's fate, he forgets that fate is often a house with many doors. To wield power over someone else's life is to hold a lamp in a dark corridor. Sooner or later, someone lights another lamp. Power is a reflecting thing, and it returns the image of its possessor with tragic clarity. We filed petitions and subpoenas. Iris managed the notary logs as if moving chess pieces. Mrs. Caldwell, whose gossip had once been a garden path, testified to seeing Elise at Braddock's on April 1st at 2:14 p.m. Mateo provided a sworn affidavit to the clerk about overhearing the names and the phone conversations in the kitchen. Each paper was a small hearthstone in the foundation we were laying. And yet, for all our paperwork, there was one true piece of proof that could undo what had been done: the original leather-bound box I had hidden in the attic for 30 years. It was a small, locked thing with a brass clasp, home to letters, to a photograph, and to a single paper that had, until now, been a secret I had kept from everyone because secrets can be weapons and also unbearable weights. I had avoided opening it because memory is sometimes a wound that refuses to scar. But there came a night when courage felt lighter than fear. I climbed to the attic and pried the box from under the rafters. My hands were stiff, but the brass clasp turned. Inside, beneath the letters tied with twine and the faded photo of a man with a rueful smile, I found a document in my husband's handwriting, a will dated July 12, 1978. It named Henri Beaumont as an executor with the instruction that certain assets be held in trust for me. Helen Turner, in gratitude for a shared life, and specifically referenced a parcel listed as Marlowe Lane Holdings, account 3219. The very account that had seen transfers of $230,000 and $200,000 in recent weeks. There were annotations in the margin, notes about the pears we once planted, about the day my husband built the porch. The handwriting was shaky but legible. I felt my knees go soft at the sight of my husband's looping letters. He had left me a place at the table in his heart and in his ledger. I felt the room tilt when I read the phrase, "In gratitude for a shared life." Gratitude is the name of a life's quiet accounts. The old will, dusty and hidden, was a testament not only to my husband's love, but to an intent that had been overwritten. Iris filed for an emergency production order. The Marlowe Lane Trust pushed back with the practiced cool of fiduciaries who believed in the sanctity of their ledgers. But records are stubborn unless burned. The trust provided a scanned copy of their sealed codicil that had been recorded on April 3, 2025, supposedly bearing my name. The signature looked like mine at first glance, but when Iris sent it to a handwriting expert, we had engaged pro bono. The differences sprang like knots. The flourish was wrong. The pressure of the pen did not match, and portions of the signature looked traced. The expert's report, dated May 3, 2025, read in clinical language, "Inconsistencies indicate probable forgery." I held that report as if it were a small, sharp thing I could carry in my pocket. The public record now had a breach. We had the email, the bank transfers, the notary ledger discrepancies, the voicemail, and the handwriting report. We had, in other words, a pattern of bad faith. The pattern suggested intent. Intent is what the law cares about. Intent makes a criminal act. Then came the moment of the decisive turn, the climax that would decide whether I remained a passive figure folding napkins or a woman who would go into a courtroom and demand to be acknowledged. It arrived not with trumpets, but with a white envelope slipped under my door at 3:06 a.m., a small thing that a delivery man might have placed there with the speed of warning. Inside was a single sheet, a scanned photograph of a document, and a note written in a hand I did not know. The photograph showed a page from Mr. Braddock's ledger, and on the ledger was a hand-scrawled note. Met with Elise Ree Codicil. She insists on expedited filing. Notary to be compensated. The note bore a date, April 2nd, 2025, at 11:47 a.m. The anonymous note smelled of someone who had seen behind closed doors. My fingers found the name at the top of the page. Henri Beaumont was written in a cramped corner, as if history itself had been scrawled in the margins. At 2:14 p.m. on that same day, someone left another voicemail on my landline, this one older, scratchier, recorded many years before, but kept as a charm by the person who delivered it to me. It was my husband's voice, and he said, in the kind of weary tenderness that only inhabited old men who have loved with patience, "If ever the house forgets you, Helen, remember Henri." The message was a family relic, my husband's promise preserved like a coin in a jar. Hearing it made the newly unearthed will glow with the light of truth. Before the final confrontation, which would be the hearing scheduled for May 12th, I must say plainly, as Dumas might have, the wrongdoer who thinks to bury the lamp of truth under the earth forgets that lanterns have lungs. They breathe, and sometimes, in the night, they blow themselves free. Power that is taken without honor is like a counterfeit coin, heavy when new, but it will not pass under the light of scrutiny. When a family makes a ledger of itself and writes out the names it finds convenient, the ledger will one day be read aloud in a room where witnesses sit. That reading is the great equalizer. The hearing loomed like a theater with velvet curtains. I arrived with Iris and Lily and a stack of documents that felt like armor. The courtroom smelled like old varnish and book glue. Mr. Braddock wore the same practiced face as a man who has argued before many judges and believes in legal wardrobe more than truth. Elise, in a dress that reflected the light like water, sat like a statue with a composure that had been carefully fabricated. The first break in their facade came when the bank officer, a man accustomed to the mechanical kindness of ledgers, was sworn in. He described the transfer of $230,000 on April 4th at 9:52 a.m. and the subsequent wire of $200,000 to Davenport Family Foundation on April 6th. He spoke of instructions that came from an authenticated email. Iris put the photocopy of that email before the court. Mr. Braddock's face did not betray surprise. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and began to speak in a tone that assumed the judge's indulgence. "You will find," he said, "that the documents were executed with all due formality. Any appearance of irregularity is unfortunate." His words were the calm of a man who believes process is a curtain you can draw across everything. Then we put forward the handwriting expert's report. The judge read it and tapped his pen. "Probable forgery," he muttered. Elise's expression faltered like a wave. Mr. Braddock rose to object, his voice the sound of someone setting up a fence. "We request an immediate forensic comparison," he said. The judge nodded and ordered it. The adjective immediate was a hinge in the door. We had shown the bench enough to suggest that a fraud might be afoot. The bench had asked for proof. We then played the voicemail, the recording of Elise on April 2nd, 7:11 p.m., telling Mr. Braddock to make it look like it was done before the gala. The judge's eyes closed as if listening to the air. The sound of her voice in that room made it hard for any actor to keep a mask. The court reporter's pen kept moving like a metronome. The judge then asked a question that felt like a blade. "Mrs. Turner, do you contest the codicil on grounds of undue influence and forgery?" I could have answered in the legal language Iris coached, but the voice that rose from within me was not merely my voice. It was the voice of a lifetime. "Yes," I said simply. "I contest because I did not sign anything like that, and my husband's will, unearthed and dated July 12, 1978, shows an earlier intent. I was left in trust, and documents have been altered. My words were not theatrical. They were the measured recounting of a life. The judge's face changed from an indifferent mask to the face of a man who had read a human ledger. There was another surprise that day. Mateo came forward with a small, thrifted cassette player and a tape. He testified he had inadvertently recorded a conversation in the kitchen where a woman, Elise, spoke, loudly enough for the phone line, instructing someone to ensure the documents are dated before the gala. The tape was rough, the voices overlapping like waves. Elise's voice was unmistakable. The judge pressed play, and the courtroom listened as if to a confession. When the tape ended, the silence afterward was the sound of a net being drawn. For a heartbeat, it seemed the whole house might explode with truth. My daughter's composure finally cracked. The smile she had worn as armor slid and revealed something very human behind the veneer. She stood and said, with eyes like polished flint, "I acted to protect the foundation." Protect the foundation? Those words were brittle. I felt the air thin as if someone had pulled a thread. But then something else happened. Mr. Braddock's face, which had until now worn mild surprise, tightened. He asked the clerk for time to consult with his client. He left the room, and with him went the illusion that everything held together. The judge issued a temporary restraining order on any transfers and scheduled a full evidentiary hearing for June 2nd, 2025. The temporary order was a thin thing, like a bandage, but it kept the blood from flowing outward. We filed an emergency motion for preservation of evidence, emails, notary logs, courier records. Iris handled the motions like a woman who stitched seams under pressure. She demanded that Mr. Braddock produce all correspondence from March 30th to April 6th, 2025. Something in his composure slipped. He produced a few emails, but others were archived. In the technological age, archiving can be an artful way of hiding things. After the court session, as the marble under our shoes hummed with the day's verdict, I was approached by a young woman in a thin coat. She had the look of someone who reads more than one book. "Mrs. Turner," she said, "my name is Iris, no relation to the notary, and I used to work as a paralegal for Braddock. I left because I could not stomach some of the things I saw." She handed me an envelope with an address and a time. "If you're brave, check the safe deposit box at 7 Elm Street, box R47. I put something there the week I quit. It might help." Her eyes were wet as she spoke. The idea of secrecy had a cost. There are moments in a life when courage feels both heavy and buoyant. It is as if you are lifting a stone, but find it floats. I went to 7 Elm Street that very night, my hand in Lily's, my heart like a room cracking into light. The bank clerk took my request with the weary courtesy of someone who has seen many lives mediated by boxes. Box J47 was small, the size you might put jewelry in. Inside, against the felt, was a single thumb drive labeled Braddock April Files. My fingers trembled as I slid it from the felt. At home, I plugged the drive into my old laptop, the machine that had always been more sentimental than swift. The files that unspooled were like a floodlight: emails, scanned documents, an MP3 file labeled Call Elise or 402025 MP3, and a PDF named Codicil Draft, Final 04032025 PDF. The PDF bore a scanned signature that purported to be mine. The MP3 was the recorded phone call where Elise spoke to an unnamed person about dates. There was even a courier receipt with a tracking number showing a packet delivered to Marlowe Lane Trust at 5:42 p.m. on April 3rd. The drive gave us a map of the deceit. I sat back and felt something lift from me. The house did not feel like an alien territory anymore. It felt like a place where my voice could be heard. And then, as if the world liked to test the courage of old women, I opened a file titled Henri Info. Docs. Inside was a scanned letter in a shaky hand, my husband's, addressed to Henri Beaumont, dated July 13th, 1978, with instructions. "If for any reason I do not survive to see the end of things, ensure Helen Turner is provided with the cottage at 18 Marlowe Lane and a sum of $230,000 for her comfort." The letter bore my husband's initials and a stamp from the county clerk. The words were simple and exact. The file also contained a note referencing a safe deposit box at Marlowe Lane Trust with the number 3219. It was like finding a map to a buried chest. My hands shook so badly that I almost dropped the thumb drive. I sat there, feeling the scale of the ledger tilt in my favor. We had emails, voicemails, handwriting analyses, bank transfers, courier receipts, and now the unassailable context of an old will and a husband's explicit instruction. The house of cards they had built had begun to wobble. But triumph has its own dangers. In the hours after the discovery, when the world seemed both bright and fragile, I received a call, no number, no preface. A voice, disguised and low, said, "We know what you have. Stop this now, Helen, or the next thing you find will be a new problem." The line clicked. Fear is a practical thing. It makes your hand hold the telephone as if it were a lifeline. I told myself that fear was an instrument and that I would play it. We prepared then for the final confrontation in June. Papers were filed, witnesses lined up. The ledger had been filled. But there is a last thing history loves to do: surprise its narrators. On a wet night in late May, as we were preparing our final motions, a courier appeared at my door with a sealed envelope. Inside was a note in my daughter's handwriting, not the polished public handwriting, but a hurried human scrawl. It read, "You will not find everything in paper. Some things live in people. Beware of Henri. Beware of Henri." The name had been a bell rung through my life, and now it sounded like a summons. I did not yet know whether Henri was a savior, a skeleton, or a secret kept to protect someone. All I knew was that as the hearing drew near, the past had become a living thing, and that people who thought their actions could be smoothed by lawyers and gala programs were wrong. I slept the night before the last round of pretrial hearings as one sleeps on a blade of glass, restful in the knowledge of imminent pain. I thought of my husband's voice and the promise of other hands. I thought of the mason jar of coins and the pearls in my palm. And I thought of Henri, whoever he was, and of the fact that the name I had heard in Mateo's morning prayer might be the axis on which all these small injustices turned. Dumas wrote that when a man accumulates an appetite for power, he forgets that appetites require payment. He would have added that the price is often paid in the currency of conscience, and conscience, once awakened, is insatiable. The day before the evidentiary hearing, Iris called with news that made my hands go cold with a strange, bright adrenaline. "They mailed something," she said. "A courier intercepted it. It was scheduled for delivery to Braddock's office today at 11:44 a.m. The package is labeled Legal, Confidential." We opened it. Inside there was a file, an original codicil dated April 3rd, 2025. On the back, handwriting, your handwriting, was visible. But here's the thing. The ink is of two types. Someone had written part with pen A, then traced over with pen B. Her voice had the sound of someone watching a slow-motion fall. And there is a small note in the packet, not in Elise's hand, that simply reads, "For execution only, keep under seal until April 4th. My throat closed. Under seal until April 4th. It meant they had planned the paper as performance, a staged act, an imitation of consent. They had manufactured the past to suit the present. This is where the turn becomes absolute. Those who make their fortunes by erasing others seldom imagine those others will return to the ledger. They forget that the record of a life is not merely ink on paper, but a constellation of witnesses, gardeners, neighbors, notaries, paralegals, who, when called, will name what they have seen. I rehearsed what I would say in court. I folded the pearls and placed them near the photocopies, as if to remind myself of what dignity looks like when held with small, stubborn hands. I went to bed early, listening to the rain on the roof, and, in the hours before sleep, I heard, in my mind, Henri pronouncing my name, Henri, like a benediction or a summons. At dawn the next day, I rose and dressed in a sensible suit that had seen better days, but still carried the dignity of a woman who had not been entirely sold. I took the mason jar with me because there is an honesty in bringing the small record of a life to a place where grand sums are argued. I walked to the courthouse with Iris and Lily at my side, and the evidence stacked in a leather folder that felt heavier than any objection. We would enter the room and speak. We would show the judge the emails and the receipts. We would play the voicemails and the tapes. We would present the handwriting expert and the bank officer. We would show the original will and the codicil with its 2 inks. We would bring the Marlowe Lane Trust's records into the light. We would name the way a daughter's hand had been used to redraw her mother's life. The machine of justice turns slowly, but when it catches momentum, it can grind away falsehoods. I felt the machine within me turn as I climbed the courthouse steps. I felt the old ledger inside me balance. I thought of my husband's voice saying, "If ever the house forgets you, Helen, remember Henri." I felt, in the chamber of my heart, a decision form. I would not be the woman who was erased. I would be the woman who spoke. Outside, a small boy on his way to school watched me pass and asked his mother, "Is that the lady with the pearls?" His mother nodded and smiled kindly. I touched the pearls at my throat and for a breath felt like the person my husband had promised I would be. We stepped into the court and the door closed behind us. I had thought I knew what the next moment would be. The unmasking, the judge's gavel, the revelation. But life is not a single chord struck. It is an orchestra that can change its tune without warning. When the bailiff called our case, Mr. Braddock rose and, with a small, almost private smile, said, "Your Honor, before we proceed, there's an issue of personal nature we must address. Miss Turner, your daughter has a letter she wishes to read into the record." Elise stood. She cleared her throat and read in a voice that surprised no one less than herself. "I have always tried to protect this family's reputation. I ask the court to consider the foundation's future." She paused as if to allow the words to sink like stones. Then she looked at me and said, as if confessing a small, terrible truth, "Mom, I did what had to be done." Her eyes were dry. The courtroom held its breath. I felt something inside me that had been patient grow fierce. I walked to the microphone. I placed my hands on it and felt the metal cool. My voice did not quaver. "You did what had to be done," I said, "but the law does not reward what is done by shadows." The judge turned his watchful eye to me, and the room seemed to sharpen. The final moment of the hearing approached, the moment when testimony would be asked for and evidentiary rulings made. I felt my heart drum a cadence I had not known it still remembered. The gavel lifted from the judge's bench like a small grave hand. And then, just as the gavel was about to fall, a messenger burst into the courtroom and handed the bailiff a single plain envelope. The bailiff's face twitched. He read the note and paled. He handed it to the judge, who opened it, scanned it, and then said, in a voice that made everyone lean forward, "This note is from Mr. Braddock. He requests a continuance and states he has new evidence that should be considered." The room hummed. A continuance, delay, a postponement. The air turned thin. We had done everything we could. A new evidence claim could be a tactic, or it might be something real, some last desperate card. Iris squeezed my hand. Lily's face was white. We looked at each other as if standing on a precipice. I had thought the climax would come with a gavel. Instead, it came with a sealed envelope and a promise of more to come. I did not yet know what was in the envelope. I only knew the name written in my past, Henri, had reappeared like a sentinel. I did not yet know whether he would be a savior, a ruin, or simply a specter. And I did not yet know that what I was about to learn would change everything. I heard the clerk say, "Court is adjourned until June 2nd, 2025. I walked out into the spring rain thinking of the mason jar, the pearls, and my husband's promise. The ledger had not closed. The house of my life had more doors than I had expected. I had one day left to prepare for a revelation that would either break the case wide open or break my heart. I opened the envelope with shaking hands and, for a single ridiculous second, expected a bomb. What I found instead was a photograph and a short, neat paragraph typed as if it were a confession. The photograph showed a man older than the photographs I had kept in the attic, a man with Henri's jaw and with the same rueful smile my husband had once described. He wore a brown coat and sat in a room that looked like a parish hall. The paragraph, however, was the thing that made my chest ache and my hands grow steady at once. Henri Beaumont. I am alive. I have documents proving Mr. Turner's original instructions. I will come forward June 2nd, 2025 at 9 a.m. HB. The note was signed in a stiff, certain hand. My heart did not know whether to leap or to break. Henri alive? After all these years? The attic had contained a will. Now the past seemed to move toward the present with footsteps. I placed the photograph next to the thumb drive Iris had found and felt the room tighten around me. This was the sort of thing that could not be invented. If Henri appeared and corroborated my husband's will and the instructions regarding Marlowe Lane Holdings, account 3219, then the codicil that had tried to erase me would unravel like cheap fabric. But people who have wound their lives around a lie sometimes cut deeper when the light comes near. There would be fury. There would be consequences. I am an old woman who knows the cost of fights. Still, I had a ledger of small wrongs and a newly stacked pile of evidence. It was time for the world to pay attention. I spent the night writing a list of witnesses and the order in which we would present them at the next hearing on June 2nd, 2025. I slept badly and dreamed of ledger pages fluttering like wounded birds. In the morning, I walked the garden with Matteo, who moved through the roses in that slow, deliberate way that keeps secrets safe. He had been the first to say the name aloud in the earliest mornings, and now he was to be one of the witnesses who would not look away. Henri's a good man, he said softly, clipping a blossom. He kept promises. He handed me the blossom as if it were proof. We prepared not only papers, but people. Lily arranged interviews with a sympathetic local reporter who loved stories about the small injustices that become large things. Iris tracked down records, phone logs, courier routes, Mr. Braddock's appointment calendar, and had them printed in neat stacks. Every time I opened a folder, it felt like peeling wallpaper in a house where someone had hidden a stain. The more we peeled, the more of the stain showed. The day Henri was to appear, the courthouse was cold as a parsonage. I sat near the front with Iris and Lily and the mason jar placed under my chair like an old relic. I felt ridiculous and dignified at once. At 8:47 a.m., a man with a cane and a hat arrived and stood at the back of the room. He looked older than the photograph in the envelope, but he had the same eyes, those watchful eyes that have seen war, distance, and the small bargains people make with conscience. He walked slowly to the witness stand, as if stepping into a place he had learned to distrust. When he opened his mouth, his voice was a rusty bell, but it carried across the room. "My name is Henri Beaumont," he said. "I knew Thomas Turner well. I was his friend. I was his executor in spirit for many years." He spoke of the small things first, the way my husband had once fixed a fence, the way he had spoken of Helen, as if she were a house to be tended, not a liability. It was the tenderness of his recollection that made the room tilt. Then Henri said plainly, "I was asked in 1978 to oversee certain holdings for Mrs. Turner. I kept documents safe because at the time, I feared what might happen if they were public." The judge listened with a face like a dry ledger. He nodded for Henri to go on. Henri described, in slow, exact terms, a packet he had taken into his keeping, a leather-bound envelope with my husband's handwriting, that instructed specific disbursements to me and the cottage at 18 Marlowe Lane. He said he had kept the packet for decades because he believed the family needed time, and because promises made in the hush of a kitchen should be honored with patience. Then he said the damning thing. I was approached in March of 2025 by a courier working for Mr. Braddock's office. They asked where the leather packet had been kept. They hinted at urgency. I refused to surrender it. Later, I saw evidence someone tried to forge signatures and to make the paper appear contemporaneous. I kept a copy of Mr. Turner's letter at a safe house. The judge raised an eyebrow. The courier's name, printed in the evidence Iris had produced, showed a transaction on April 3, 2025 at 5:42 p.m. The chain of custody tightened like a noose around falsehood. When Henri confirmed that my husband's letter had explicitly named the Marlowe Lane Holdings, account 3219, and that it had specified a sum of about $230,000 for her comfort, the courtroom made a small, audible sound. People adjusted as if someone had thrown a net. The judge read a passage aloud and then looked over his spectacles at Mr. Braddock. The lawyer's jaw had tightened. It was not enough to have Henry's testimony. Evidence is a demanding thing, but combined with the email dated April 3, 2025, instructing Mr. Braddock to ensure the notary is available and that the document reflects a contemporaneous date, and the voicemail of my daughter, instructing the falsification, the pattern had become a fabric too dense to deny. The handwriting expert and the bank officer were called, and they affirmed what we already had: probable forgery. Transfers of $230,000 and $200,000 on April 4, 6, 2025, and records of courier deliveries with suspicious timing. Then something happened that belonged in the kind of book Dumas might have read as a child. Elise, who had sat like a statue for much of the proceeding, stood and asked to speak. Her voice was rough with something like pleading. "Judge," she said, "my intention was to protect the Davenport Foundation, which supports clinics and schools, and—" she faltered. "I was afraid that if assets were mismanaged, that the mission my husband and I built would be jeopardized." Her words were a kind of confession of motive, not of method. Motives can be tender, methodless choices can be criminal. The judge's face softened for a moment with the human calculus of weighing good intentions against wrong actions. Then he did the only thing that would perhaps break both hearts and egos. He referred the matter for criminal investigation to the district attorney. He did not at that moment declare guilt or innocence. He ordered that the transfers be reversed where possible, that the Davenport Family Foundation's $200,000 wire be frozen pending review, and that the codicil dated April 3, 2025 be declared not duly executed and therefore void pending full forensic analysis. He also ordered Mr. Braddock to surrender all related documents for a criminal grand jury review. Finally, the judge set a civil ruling date for June 23, 2025 at 10 a.m. for final disposition of the estate accounting. The legal machinery began to grind, or perhaps finally to creak into honest motion. My victory was not immediate nor total, but it was undeniable. The court had refused to legitimize a fraud. The judge's temporary orders were a bandage, yes, but they were also a recognition. After the hearing, emotions spilled into the hallway like rainwater from a gutter. Iris and Lily hugged me, their faces wet. Matteo stood at the back and tipped his cap. I felt old sorrow and a new lightness, as if a tight rope around my ribs had been loosened. For a week, the world turned toward the courthouses and the bank offices. The DA opened an investigation into alleged forgery and wire fraud. Mr. Braddock's office, which had once worn confidence like a mantle, became a place of whispers. There were, of course, the vultures, charity boards, and distant cousins who sniffed, the heir for possible advantage. But mostly there were quiet people who had been shown the way a family might fold a mother into an old story, to keep her out of sight. Watching them squirm felt neither exquisite nor cruel. It felt like justice measured in small, necessary units. During that week, something even more earnest happened. A woman named Iris, the paralegal, who had left Mr. Braddock's office, came forward with corroboration that Mr. Braddock had discussed a plan to streamline certain inheritances if heirs were amenable. Her affidavit was a small thing in legal language, but it carried the weight of a truth told by someone who had worked in the machine and then stepped away. And then, on June 10, 2025, a week after the judge's civil scheduling, a public hearing was held where the DA read excerpts of evidence that made men shuffle their shoes and made pretense look thin. There were emails, courier receipts, bank transfers, a notary ledger forged in part, and a voicemail that played like a confession. The DA recommended indictment for Mr. Braddock for forgery of a legal instrument, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and aiding and abetting. Elise was offered the chance to cooperate with investigators. She declined. The public, which loves a scandal, leaned in. This is the place where the revenge I had always imagined, if one is honest, was not about cruelty, but about a slower thing, restoration. The kind of revenge Dumas revels in is theatrical, yes, but it is also moral. It seeks not only to wound, but to right. In these late days, I understood something that my husband had known in his bones. Truth, like a river, erodes even the hardest stone if given enough time. There is in persistent truth a kind of tenderness. Dumas would have loved the irony. Those who thought themselves architects of fate discovered that fate has other builders. On June 23, 2025, the civil disposition took place. The judge, after reviewing the forensic analysis, which reiterated the handwriting expert's finding of probable forgery, the bank's return of $230,000 to the Marlowe Lane Trust, and Henri's sworn testimony, ruled decisively. He declared the codicil invalid and set aside the transfers that had been made without proper legal standing. The court ordered restitution where possible and awarded me, Helen Turner, possession of the cottage at 18 Marlowe Lane, along with a monetary award of $230,000 for my comfort and legal costs. The judge added that he would recommend that the DA pursue criminal charges. That sentence felt like a bell ringing the end of something and the beginning of another. Elise stood as the judge read the order. For the first time in what felt like ages, I looked at her, and she looked at me not as a ledger item, but as a mother. Her face crumpled in a way that made the world small and human. Later, as we left the courtroom, she came to me and said, without the practiced polish of boardroom speech, "Mama, I am sorry." It was not a legal plea. It was a human one. I placed my hand over hers. We did not hug like two people who had never been far apart. We touched like survivors of a storm who have seen the roof lifted. But the court's civil ruling was only part of the end I sought. The DA convened a grand jury. Mr. Braddock was indicted on multiple counts, forced to answer in a criminal court for the alleged forgery and fraud. He had built a career on smoothing paper. Now his own paper would be his undoing. In a quiet, human way, the wheels we had set in motion were turning. There was a day, one of those afternoons, when the sun seems to tilt toward gold, that I walked back into the cottage at 18 Marlowe Lane. The key in my hand shook with a tender kind of triumph. The cottage smelled of lemon polish and wood, as if my husband had been home waiting to fix a loose hinge. I placed the mason jar on the kitchen sill and felt the light spill through the coins like a small benediction. I opened a drawer and found, as if in gratitude for my insistence, the little leather-bound ledger my husband had used to keep small accounts, dates of payments, promises, a note in his hand that said, quite simply, "Helen, for the moments." I pressed my thumb to the paper that carried his ink and felt my heart steady. The Davenport Foundation's $200,000 remained frozen and subject to investigation. Many donors recoiled at the thought that their gifts might have been used to cloak misdeeds. The Foundation's board suspended Elise from any role pending further review. Her husband faced reputational ruin and professional consequences. There were board meetings and resignations. The social prunings that follow scandal can be severe. I will not lie, seeing them humbled gave me an odd, quiet pleasure. But satisfaction is not the point of a life well tended. The point, at least for me, was to have my name restored to the place where it belonged, to sit at a table that did not pretend I was an ornament, to be the woman my husband had promised to remember. There were small, tender restitutions in the months that followed. The county clerk recorded the July 12, 1978 will as the controlling document in the estate, and the records were updated. The Marlowe Lane Trust returned funds where lawful. The bank reversed unauthorized transfers where possible. The DA's criminal case proceeded in its own time. Mr. Braddock's trial would taste of long depositions and the kind of slow legal grind that neither poet nor villain adores. He eventually pled guilty to lesser charges in a negotiated plea that included restitution and disbarment, an outcome that left him professionally stripped. His penalties were not revenge in the theatrical sense, but they were a correct accounting for someone who used the law as a curtain. I was not the sort of woman to dance on anyone's ruin. I did, however, receive a small measure of the dignity my husband had written into his ledger. I had the cottage at 18 Marlow Lane, and the $230,000 I had been promised was placed in a trust that would allow me to live with comfort and to give to causes my hands could touch, local clinics, a small scholarship in Lily's name, and a fund for garden tools because there is no disgrace in looking after roses. I paid back those who had helped me, Mrs. Caldwell with a portion for her kindness, Mateo for his loyalty, Iris for her sleepless nights combing through ledgers. The most strange and wonderful thing was watching the community shift its gaze. People who had once considered my presence quaint began to ask my opinion on small council matters. My emails, yes, I had learned to use email with Lily propped beside me, began to fill with invitations to speak to neighborhood groups about elder rights and dignity. I found that my story had a use beyond my marble-slick anger. It could be a lesson. If revenge is a ledger, then perhaps its final line is education. I do not pretend the moral is simple. There are days when I walk past the grand house and remember that it was my daughter's choices, born of fear and a hunger to preserve her world, that began this. I love my daughter. Loving someone does not mean excusing what she did. The lesson I want people to hear is not one of triumphal gloating, but rather a stubborn insistence that truth matters, that promises made in the hush of kitchens are legally and morally significant, and that dignity belongs to the ones who have kept the hearth and stitched the hems. Dumas would have written that when a man covets power over another, he forgets that power steals twice, first from its victim, then from its possessor. For the man who uses deceit must live with the knowledge of his own falsity. To be deprived of name and home is a cruelty. To deprive a family member of the right to belong is a violence. The scales of justice, slow as they be, tilt eventually toward balance. When people ask me now what I did, what I would counsel an old woman who finds herself erased, I tell them plainly, gather your witnesses, document the small things, do not be ashamed to ask for help, and remember the names written in the margins of your life. Keep your pearls in a safe place and your courage on your person. A life is made of small, steady acts. When those acts are counted, they can outweigh a single great lie. I also tell them this, revenge, when it is not vengeance but restoration, is the work of many hands. Mine were not the only ones. Mateo's hands dug into the ground and told me truths. Iris's hands sorted ledgers. Lily's hands scrolled emails and held a phone like a lantern. We were a chorus, not a single voice. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and the radio plays a slow waltz, Lily will bring her children to visit, and they ask me about the pearls or the mason jar. They think of these things as curiosities, but to me they are history, proof of endurance. I show them the ledger my husband once kept and tell them that the greatest currency is the kind of promise you can keep when no one is watching. So here is the moral I leave with you. Dignity is not a garment that can be rented or repossessed. It is the work of a life. If someone tries to write you out of your own story, gather your papers, speak your truth, and do not be afraid to ask the law to read the margins. The smallest of objects, a mason jar, a letter, a photograph, can be the things that save you. If my story touched you, share it with someone who needs courage today. If it moved you, subscribe. This old heart has more truth yet to tell, and I will not be silent. If you have a story of your own, leave it in the comments. I read them like letters in a biscuit tin. We will keep each other's names safe.